watching MP Live. Well, the new Premier of Ontario is Doug Ford, here with their perspective on the winner, the campaign and the road ahead, from the National Post columnist Andrew Coyne, Chris Sully, Christy Blatchford, and from Toronto's Toronto Sun, I should say, the editor-in-chief, Adrian Batra. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Initial reactions. Doug Ford is the Premier of Ontario. Andrew Coyne.
That's mine too. It's going to be an interesting 4 years. He has a talent for mayhem, and I'm sure it's not going to diminish. And the other flip side, of course, is...
Chrissy?
My first reaction, my natural reaction, is laughter. And the next one is anticipation. I agree. I think it's going to be a wonderful time to be a journalist.
Adrian, who did you vote for and why?
No, I think everybody knows exactly who I voted for. People wanted change, and they got change, and in a big, big way. The province of Ontario was painted blue last night in a tidal wave. And I think Doug Ford is going to surprise a lot of people with how he governs, the people whom he surrounds himself by, and it's a good day for the people of Ontario.
Chris, is it a good day for the people of Ontario?
I just don't know. I mean, I think this government could look like a whole lot of different things. And as Adrian says, if he could surround himself with his moderate MPs and really foreground them and take advice from people, or he could be
Doug Ford.
the sort of the belligerent Doug Ford. But there's at least two different Doug Fords. So I wouldn't predict what this is going to look like. I think it could look like a whole lot of different things.
Let's take a look at some of those maps from Ontario. I think you all have those maps and you know what they look like. Let's go back to 2014, what that looked like in Ontario, which was of course painted all red. 2018 brings a very different picture. What were some of the, I guess, key areas where the PCs won, where they dominated, and where they lost?
Well, I mean, the PCs did well across the province. I mean, the key was that they needed to keep the NDP from breaking through in areas like Scarborough and Etobicoke and some of these ridings like Sarnia and Peterborough, where the NDP really had to break through if they had any hope of pulling this off. And they didn't pull it off. The PCs pulled it off quite handily in those ridings. So it just didn't work out the way it needed to. For the
And even in Brampton, of course, they were targeting a lot of seats in Brampton. And we know Guruthan Singh, of course, who's Jagmeet Singh's brother. He won handily there. But even if you look at Scarborough they anticipated it to be totally orange. But where Doug Ford won in those specific ridings, that is where he did well in the 2014 mayoralty race. So that sort of, quote, Ford factor did matter for those ridings.
Where these elections, federal and provincial, are decided is in the suburbs and exurbs. Conservatives usually do well rurally, usually do very poorly in the inner cities, but it's when they're doing well, they're winning those suburbs, the 905 belt, as we say, and they certainly cleaned up en masse in this election. What was interesting was in the inner cities, in the central cities, the Liberals were replaced by the NDP en masse, except for a couple of enclaves in Ottawa and Toronto. But
hugely in Toronto.
Yeah,
I mean, downtown
not even
Toronto,
close.
just an absolute...
I live in St. Paul's, and there were three strong candidates, and I thought they would be a Liberal or a Tory, as traditionally it has been. And it must be the first time St. Paul's has had a new Democrat. Surely to God.
What a legacy to be the person who lost St. Paul's for the Liberals.
Yeah, you sort of look at that one, and when in Ottawa Vanier is like the strong Liberal strongholds, but not this time. Not for St. Paul's.
Did Doug Ford win this for the PCs, or did he almost lose it for them? Because there's been talk that it wasn't for him. It was for the party, for their collective idea. They
came into this election 15 to 20 points ahead for months. So he didn't manage to lose it. But I don't think it was really a pro-Ford vote. I'm sure some voted for that, but it was mostly people wanted to get rid of the Liberals, or a certain section of the population wanted to get rid of the Liberals. And then, of course, what also could aid in the Liberal support was a certain section of the population then was very alarmed at the prospect of Ford getting in and switched from the Liberals to the NDP because they looked like the party that could best stop him. I actually think if it had been Christine Elliott as leader, they would have won even bigger than they did.
Well, look, I think let's be a little charitable to Doug Ford for a moment. He came into a party that went through this drama with Patrick Brown. He was a leader in very short order. He had a big mess on his hands. He had all these issues with candidates and different ridings. And the PCs have basically been in the lead for, let's say, 3 years in the polls, for example. So yeah, he didn't lose it for them. This is a party that's been out in the wilderness for 15 years. You can imagine the pressure that was on Ford, because he was very well aware members of his party didn't want him. So a lot of people in the public didn't want him. And he confounded them yet again, and with a very successful night. So a lot of credit is where it's due to him.
Okay, let me ask you. So there are plenty of pundits that said, basically this was an election whereby you couldn't choose a clear winner just because there weren't great candidates. And of the three, there weren't any great candidates. So was this the best person for the job ultimately?
No, not in my view. I think the best person for the job is Kathleen Wynne. I mean, if you were coming from another planet, you were looking at the three candidates and you judged them only by who the leaders were and how well-spoken they were and how substantial they seemed, I think she would have been the clear winner because she's intelligent, she can think on her feet. Guess what? She speaks in sentences, not, kind of moronic clauses. So I liked her for that reason, and I think, if voters were only voting on the quality of the candidate, the leadership candidate, they would have picked her. But obviously, 15 years of Liberal government, a lot of voter fatigue, a lot of scandals, people were enraged by much of what they saw, and a lot of that was sort of captured, I think, in the Hydro One thing, where the board itself of Hydro One had voted themselves a rich raise just in the middle of the election campaign. I mean, come on!
Chris, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I think, is Doug Ford the best person for the job? No, but on the other hand, the Tories have a pretty solid team, and it looked to me, if you looked at the polls, that the brand really is still quite strong. I mean, you look at the polls, it's people trust the party the most on the economy, on fighting, cutting the deficit, cutting debt. I mean, it's ironic because the platform doesn't promise any of that. Like, the platform is a big spending platform with no specifics as to where all these savings are going to come from. But I think that enough people still saw the party, however they factored in Doug Ford to that decision, they saw the party as the only real natural option, given that they wanted to get rid of the Liberals.
It was slightly less big spending, so far as anyone can make out, than the other two parties. So not particularly conservative, but maybe just conservative enough. I think the problem for the NDP was, there was this large block of voters, not by any means the whole province. Of course, the Tories got 40% of the vote, not 100%. But there was this large block of voters that wanted to get rid of the Liberals. Did they want to go with a party that was going to do everything the Liberals did and more? Or did they want a party of the Conservatives that would do everything the Liberals did and slightly less?
That's what, I mean, I
with a slate of pretty radical candidates. Too,
I always wonder if NDP had run one of their centrist platforms that they had the last two times, if that might have been better for them.
The NDP?
They were determined not to be outflanked by Wynne, but it turned out Wynne wasn't the problem.
But Wynne went so left, right? I mean, there was no space and no daylight left between the NDP and the Liberal at this point.
I mean.
So where is she left to go? I mean,
some key moments in 5 or 10 seconds, some key moments from the campaign.
Certainly the most striking one for me was when Wynne conceded the election with 5 days to go.
Yes.
It wasn't any great surprise to anybody. You could sort of see the thinking behind it, that if people were worried that by voting Liberal they'd actually elect a Liberal government, she could set those voters' minds at rest, but certainly nothing I've ever seen in a previous election.
Christy.
I thought it was interesting, the theft of the 407 customer data and the questions that followed and still remain about the legitimacy of many of the, I think as many as a dozen of the Tory nomination races. I think these are big problems. I'll leave it at that.
Key moments?
Well, I wish I would have gone first, but so no, I agree with Andrew. It's extraordinary for someone to write their own political obituary before the votes are even cast. So Premier Wynne resigning and just saying, I can't do this anymore. I know I'm not going to win. What a moment. I mean, I can't remember a time when something like that has ever happened. But the 407 stuff was certainly significant and remains a problem, you're right, and they have a big challenge on their hands. I think when Bernarda Ford came out and said that the family is not providing for her, and all of the stuff that's being thrown at Doug, it didn't seem to matter. Change was coming.
Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I have to go with Wynne again. I mean, she comes in promising to be a different kind of politician. I mean, that's basically what allowed her to get a majority in 2014, was the idea that she was turning the page from Dalton McGuinty, and she goes out with having brought in a Doug Ford majority. and having torpedoed the NDP, having sabotaged the NDP's chances, which leaves so many Ontarians having to look at her and say, like, what?
Sorry, not sorry.
What was that? Yeah, sorry.
Well, we're going to take a look at some key moments and look back at the election.
Kathleen, you got a nice smile on your face there. Kathleen.
So do you. Oh, and that's probably the friendliest moment we will have.
Kathleen Wynne, the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, the Progressive Conservative Party leader Doug Ford, and the New Democratic Party leader Andrea Horwath.
Well, Mr. Ford and Ms. Wynne fought about who's going to make the worst premier of Ontario. I think this election's our opportunity to do something completely different.
Now imagine a leader who asks the very rich to pay a little more to make this happen. I'm Andrea Horwath. For me, it's not a dream, it's a plan.
The NDP, they have radical activists that get their inspiration from Adolf Hitler.
I want to say straight up that any memes that had anything to do with Hitler is absolutely abhorrent, and it's something that I absolutely reject completely.
Who do you trust with your money? The NDP can't do math. They made a mistake of $7 billion on their own budget.
We haven't even seen any numbers from Mr. Ford.
Mr. Ford, you know, I think if you had a plan, you would share it with the people of Ontario.
It's about turning this province around and getting it back on track.
Doug Ford is here for the people of Ontario.
You talk about being for the people,
reducing taxes.
but your
That's what
plan,
our plan
is for the rich.
I'd like to know who all the so-called rich people
You're
are.
getting them $1,200
you know
a year, you should
something?
know them.
By the way, you don't have to be there from 8 o'clock in the morning to 4:30 because we know the government shuts down after 4:30, 5 o'clock.
Oh.
If you work night times, you work afternoons,
ever been to a
Peter,
daycare?
you will be able...
Brownouts, blackouts, we rebuilt the system. That cost a lot of money. We've now spread the cost over a longer period of time and gave people a 25% reduction.
After you gave them a 300% increase,
because we
Kathleen,
built the
you
system.
ignored people for years and years.
Sorry, not sorry. I'm really genuinely sorry that more people don't like me.
Doug.
That's
the fact
rich.
is,
Coming from you,
no,
that is
the
rich.
fact-
Got your hands caught in the cookie jar. I caught them all for the backroom deals, $14 million
No,
of
Doug,
bonuses.
that was you. That was you in the Greenbelt in the backroom. That wasn't me.
That's what your plan has done. You've been in office for 15 years.
You go with
You
a
want an
little-
answer?
I can do better. That work never stops. Better never stops. Neither will I.
I don't know who voters will choose. That is up to them. But I'm pretty sure that it won't be me.
And that's exactly what's going to happen.
Doug Ford is the new Premier of Ontario. So if you're the new Premier, what is the first thing on your agenda? Day one, what are you doing?
Well, the first thing should be to get control of the province's finances, and which they signally failed to promise during the election campaign. I think they need to bring in a budget pretty quickly because the last Liberal budget brought in a raft of new spending. They abandoned any pretense of trying to balance the budget. It's always hard to cut existing spending. You always take a lot of political grief, so you might as well try and head off the new spending before it gets out the door. So I think speed is of the essence in that regard, but they've got to get serious about the province's finances. All of the opposition parties, or both the opposition parties, ran tut-tutting about the Liberal Party's misstatement of the books, as the Auditor General pointed out, but ran on the same set of numbers. And the Auditor General's numbers are pretty clear that we are headed for 45% to GDP ratio, even assuming no recession. So getting control of the finances to me is job one.
What is he doing on day one? And just to back up a little bit to Andrew's point, you know, we've seen Doug Ford's record in City Hall. You've written about that extensively. You know, is the past a good indication of the future? What should he be doing day one?
I have no idea if the past is a good indication of the future. It often is, but who knows? I certainly agree with Andrew that you know, if only to start crafting a coherent agenda, to start rationalizing all his spending promises against all his savings promises, he needs to. I mean, I would expect one of the first things is we'll see is that this you know, bringing in the outside auditors, and for whatever good it's going to do, that's going to buy them some time. That's going to let them get settled. We're going to say, you know, we're going to see these. We'll find the savings. This is what happened at City Hall. We'll find the savings. and we'll move ahead.
And they'll do the cupboard is bare routine. If we'd only known the state of the books.
Yeah, I think that's.
They did almost no savings actually at City Hall either. Let's be frank. I mean, they talked about finding the savings, and many people, me included, thought there must be fat to be trimmed. But I'm buggered if I can remember any fat being trimmed.
Let me chime in on that since I was there at the time.
Yeah.
There were absolutely savings found at City Hall. Not only when they did
not $1 billion.
Not only when they did the core services review, there was efficiencies that were found because what the Rob Ford administration did was put a number of overhead with respect to emergency services. They put that all under one banner. They got a labor deal done that saved millions of dollars for taxpayers, and they outsourced and privatized garbage.
The garbage
on one
thing
side
was a great victory.
That was absolutely. So look, has it always been a challenge for Doug Ford to suggest the $1 billion? Yes, that's not helpful.
Fake news.
But
Or
they,
true. Yes, or true.
They
Yes.
absolutely had a decent record, and not only that. When the Ford administration took over in 2010 from Miller, they had to align the budgets, and I know that sounds a bit wonky, and I'm not going to bore people with it, but you have to align the budget with the money that's coming in versus what is being spent. At the provincial level, we call it an interim supply bill, right? We don't have that at City Hall, so we had to change the budget time, come out with one quickly. So to your other question, when should Doug come out with a budget? Right away. And yes, he's bought himself 4 years.
And that was a viewer question we should mention.
And he's bought himself 4 years to be able to blame the Liberals. And we heard from the financial accountability officer just weeks before the election, $15 billion is what is missing. If they want to balance the budget by 2023, where's that money coming in? And $6.5 billion in the Liberals didn't talk about that, the gem of a deficit.
The problem with the $1 billion promise, the $1 billion claim though, is even if you take it as true, you divide that by 4 years, like $1 billion is 1/10 of a single year's budget at City Hall, gross expenditures. It doesn't add up to this 4% that Doug says. Now, look, Queen's Park is not City Hall. I don't know. 15 years of Liberal government, I'm sure. Well, I'm not sure.
Just stack up 15 years of Auditor General's reports. You'll find money in there.
The issue isn't whether there's waste in government. Anybody with any experience of government knows there is. But anybody with any experience of government also knows it's really hard to get at the waste in just that kind of efficiency sense. Yeah. It's this giant, humongous, hundreds of thousands of employees. We're adding.
Fire anything.
Well, exactly. And he said he won't fire anything.
Yeah,
so we're adding tens of billions of dollars to the debt every year in Ontario. You're not going to get to anything close to fiscal health just by efficiencies. You're going to have to make choices about what government does.
That's right.
And he has made very clear he doesn't want to make any choices.
And he has said, though, he will run deficits for the first 2 years, and he will spend at the same level in which is being currently spent at $150 billion. So this is a massive challenge. Even if it was Andrea Horwath that became premier, I mean, she would be facing the same issues.
And I say again, we are 9 years since the last recession, which was only a mild one at that. Mm-hmm. Everybody in government at every level the government in this country is operating on the principle that there will never be a recession again. Because if you factor in the possibility of a recession, the probability of a recession, then your fiscal numbers go, as bad as they are now, go to hell.
So business competitiveness is something that's all the talk in Canada right now. How does, and I should actually just go back a little bit because Doug Ford did mention in his victory speech, Ontario is open for business. How does he go about drumming up business for Ontario?
Well, I think part of it is reputational, part of it is being the salesperson, so I don't think there's anything wrong with sending that message that you're going to be less antagonistic, less regulatory heavy. I think, for example, they've said they'll go slower on the increase in the minimum wage. That will probably be reassuring to some businesses. They're going to give them their due, they were the only party that ran on cutting tax rates. Whether we can afford cut them right now is another matter. But that, again, I think sends a reassuring signal to businesses.
Really quickly, in 10 seconds or less, or in 5 seconds or less, tell me first promise that they're going to break.
Whoa. Go to someone else.
How about, I don't know that this was an explicit promise, but Doug Ford once said in the last couple of days that he was the most open and media friendly of the three leaders, which was a clear untruth. So let's see if he does actually start taking the full range of questions today at his press conference or the next few press conferences.
Buying the Toronto subway system, I think, may be a bridge too far.
The operating cost is going to be very expensive on the upload on that. Well, I'll tell you the first promise he shouldn't break is the buck of beer, because that one will be that's a winner. I think the first one will likely be a scaling back of what they wanted to do with respect to the tax rates. I think they're going to find that the cupboard is far more than bare. It's barren. And it's going to be a challenge for them to do that. But he will be determined to do so.
You got one?
I can picture them walking away from this sex ed, this promise to repeal it. That is such a turkey, that issue. Like, if they repeal it and then give whoever their education minister is, I mean, you're never going to get a group of parents together to agree on a sex ed curriculum, because there's some people that just oppose any sex ed curriculum. Everyone has their own different hang-ups. I think that'll be, it might not be explicitly broken, but I expect that the Tanya Granick-Allen crowd will not get what they are hoping for.
Yeah.
What does that relationship look like with our Prime Minister? I mean, they come, they don't necessarily see eye to eye on a couple of issues, on marijuana, on carbon pricing. So what does that relationship look like?
Well, carbon pricing is certainly going to be an enormous flashpoint in this, because if you take Ford at his word, which I don't, but if you do, he's not going to implement either cap and trade or accept a federal carbon price. So he's going to take them to court, et cetera. He's going to fight them politically. If you're the federal Liberals, do you want to actually campaign in the next year up to an election of, we will tax you in Ontario with this thing that you just voted for a party that didn't like? That's an interesting question. At the same time, I think if the Liberals are smart, I know I don't want to overdraw the comparisons with Trump, but they've seen this move before. They've had a little bit of experience in how do you handle this kind of unpredictable character. And you know, he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer, Ford, and the Liberals may well find they can work with him.
Ultimately, you want a piece of that pie, that federal pie, right? So he has to work with the Prime Minister in some respect. I mean, you still want dollars for infrastructure programs. So what does he have to do?
Well, I think you could even tell from the statement that Prime Minister Trudeau issued last night. It was a shot right away saying, we want to work on these things together, environment, transit, et cetera. So that was definitely a sort of signal to Premier-elect Ford that I'm still coming after the provinces for the carbon tax and to want to implement that. But that's in trouble if we look west and Jason Kenney gets elected in Alberta. On the marijuana issue, I think what Premier-elect Ford would want to do is not dissimilar to what's happening with Premier Pallister in Manitoba, have it both public and private. I think people would be genuinely surprised, and I know I keep saying this to all four of you. Doug Ford will have an ability to have a relationship with Trudeau. He understands that he has to, but it's not only that, it's also the people that will be around Doug Ford, his team, his cabinet ministers. So they can have bluster as two leaders, but a lot of the stuff that happens behind the scenes, staff to staff, diplomatic, whatever. So that will be very important.
And we are heading into it, as you said, we are heading into a federal election. So there's a two-way thing there. I mean, if Ford can sort of rally the people behind this fight against the carbon tax.
Well, he's got a mandate to do so.
And you've got Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, and then if you have Jason Kenney in Alberta, I mean, everyone has always sort of said that it's talked about it as sort of inevitable that the feds are going to impose this carbon tax if the provinces don't agree with it. I don't know. I mean, they're tied in the polls with the Tories federally heading into an election year. Is that really a hill you want to die on?
Not necessarily a winning issue.
Now, we have had some viewer questions asking about, what about the Liberals? What does that pathway look like now? I mean, after 15 years in Ontario, how do they recover? Can they recover?
They'll recover just fine. They're Liberals, after all. They know how to do this, and I have no doubt that, I don't know how long it will take. It'll probably take a while, but they're better at it. They're better at building a party, I think, than the Ontario PCs are. I mean, even now, it was only, 2 months ago that Vic Fideli, as the interim leader, said, this party's a mess. We'll never fix it. It's going to take months. The rot is deep. 2 weeks later, the rot is gone. It's all good. Done. So the Liberals are better than that.
But let's not, and you're absolutely right, the enduring power of the Liberal brand and organizational ability is very true. But this is the worst result for the Liberals in terms of the popular vote for any Liberal party, federal or provincial, in Ontario in the history of the country. Wow. It's bad.
And we've heard all the historic lows, and it hasn't happened in a long time. What about the Green Party? They have a seat now.
I in my way was rooting for Mike Schreiner. I mean, it's nice to have my colleague Laurie Goldstein, who has forgotten more about hydro and electronic pricing in Canada than most of us will ever know, was very keen on Mike Schreiner because he talked about him being the only one with any logical plan when it comes to the electricity grid and the hydro system in this province and how to move forward on that. So it's a good, reasonable voice to have around the table, and one voice can be effectual for sure.
I'm trying to understand. I live in Ontario, so this election is important to me. But if I'm in Saskatchewan, why is this election in Ontario important to the rest of Canada? I mean, just to go back a little bit, Ontario does contribute 40% to Canada's GDP. Mm-hmm. But if I'm out west, if I'm out east, if I'm in northern Canada, why is it important?
Well, it's partly we were mentioning that the whole carbon tax fight is obviously huge. Whether Ontario's economy is doing well or poorly is obviously very important to the rest of the country. And thirdly, Doug Ford is now one of, if not the leading conservative politician in Canada. I mean, up there with Andrew Scheer. And this is a part of a battle for defining what conservatism is going to look like, large C conservatism in Canada. Scheer represents one strain, Ford represents another strain, Maxime Bernier represents another strain, and this is all part of that mix that's important to all parts of the country.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I'm not sure that Scheer and Ford represent strains that I could define. Bernier represents a strain that I could define. Mm-hmm. But what is Canadian conservatism right now? I mean, Patrick Brown put out this centrist platform that agreed to a carbon tax, and it all added up. Doug Ford threw that out, but he adopted a lot of Brown's other policies. I don't know. Yeah. There's days where I look at it and I think that it's not so much. It's just a tribe at a certain level mm-hmm. at this point, and not so much a contest of different ideas.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, that's what it looks
like. So being from Saskatchewan, we're like raised to despise Ontario. But it does matter for the carbon tax reason. The health of Ontario is the health of Canada, and so financially, it's an important thing. But also, a Premier-elect Ford having a relationship with a Premier of Saskatchewan, for example, or in British Columbia, and even Rachel Notley in BC or in Alberta, excuse me. That stuff matters when, as the collective premiers want things from this federal government, they have to work together. And Doug's going to learn in very, very short order how different it is to campaign and how important it is to govern. And it's a very big learning curve.
And also, his government is going to be desperately short of funds, and the feds have the money.
That's right.
And there'll be some combination of bullying and pleading, but that'll be, I think, one of the major issues is trying to get the Liberals to help them out, and the Liberals setting conditions on their help.
In 5 seconds or less, what does that cabinet look like? I mean, we've heard some of those names, mm-hmm. Caroline Mulroney, Christine Elliott, Vic Fedeli. What does that cabinet look like? Who gets what portfolio in your estimation?
Vic Fedeli makes a lot of sense as a finance minister. Christine Elliott makes a lot of sense as a health minister. I mean, I think that's a real strength going forward. Caroline Mulroney could put her just about anywhere, and it seems like a fairly competent person. So I think that's a real strength. And Elliott and Fedeli are two that I would, put front and center right there.
If you say Kathleen Wynne something.
If I what?
Who do you think? What do you think about the cabinet going forward?
Well, I agree with Chris. I mean, there are some obvious contenders, but beyond that, remember, I tend to prefer to read about rapists and murderers than politicians. So,
assuming there's a difference.
Depending on what day it is, it might be one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing you can say is that there's Ford kind of atop this party that, to a great extent, doesn't necessarily resemble him. Some do, but lots of the party establishment are of a very different conservative stripe than he is, different personality types. Maybe more appealing to centrist voters. And if he's smart, he will certainly put them in the window shop. But again, I'm not sure he necessarily is.
And he will. And he, as the Premier-elect, will set a tone. He's going to set a tone for this government. That's a tone for his cabinet ministers. So yes, all those names, Christine Elliott, Caroline Mulroney, shout out to our former chairman, Rod Phillips. He will be a very important part of Ford administration. And he's got a lot of people around that table that have financial experience, not necessarily a la Bill Morneau federally, but someone that was recently elected, Peter Bethlen-Flavey. Peter Bethlen-Flavey was recently elected. He's got a lot of experience in the financial sector. He's a smart guy. And as we're doing this, Doug Ford is about to announce his transition team. And so that will be indicative of the type of people he's going to have around it.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for joining us. And of course, if you want more of this conversation, just go to our website, nationalpost.com. Thanks for watching.